Hi, everybody. We're just slowly starting to bring everybody into this meeting. So thanks so much for joining us. I know it's always a busy time on a Tuesday morning of a sitting week, so we will get stuck in. People will be joining us over the next few minutes as well, I'm sure. So we will just get right into it. My name's Kate Fairman. I'm the Greens member in the New South Wales Upper House with the Environment Portfolio, and I chaired the inquiry into koala populations and their habitat. I've just organised this very quick briefing by some environmental stakeholders into the government's proposed Local Land Services Amendment miscellaneous bill. So this is going to be debated tomorrow in the lower house, I understand it. We have been told probably not in the upper house this week, although yesterday we heard differently. This bill is supposed to be the compromise that the Liberals and the Nationals came to over the koala SEP issue, but it goes so much more further than that in terms of winding back environmental protections. That's what we've organised this briefing for. Welcome, Dom as well has just joined us. So I'm going to flick to Rachel Walmsley from the EDO, Dylan Pugh then from North East Forest Alliance, and Dom King, who can give the regional perspective of a council that doesn't have a koala plan of management approved by the department or in this bill. And then we might be able to take questions. But I also thought these stakeholders can put their contact details into the chat as well for all of you who are wanting to ask questions. We have a range of staff members on the call from MPs who are in caucus and various things this morning because it's a busy time. So if you want to ask questions, feel free to throw them in the chat as well, but we'll share the details of these stakeholders so we can continue going on. And we've got a huge interest, lots of people have joined. So straight over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Kate. And you'll notice I have put in the chat a link to a briefing note that EDO has prepared that sets out the changes to the bill and also the changes that were gazetted on Friday to the SEP and the guidelines. So there's a lot more detail in that briefing note. I'll just touch on some of the key changes now. So the idea of this bill, the purported reason for this bill is to decouple the land clearing and forestry laws from the koala SEP. On the basis that robust protections exist for koalas. If you read the second reading speech, and let's be clear from the outset, they do not. The policy settings that underpin this bill are actually inconsistent with recommendations made by the New South Wales Audit Office, the Natural Resources Commission, the inquiry into koalas held by the Upper House, and in fact, the independent biodiversity legislation review. So you may recall that the Audit Office of New South Wales found the land management framework was not effectively assessing land clearing on private land. The Natural Resources Commission found since the land clearing laws have started a 13-fold increase in land clearing, and 9 out of 11 regions now have biodiversity at risk. Both those reports were absolutely scathing and found regulatory failure. The Upper House inquiry into koalas recommended review of land clearing laws to strengthen them and recommended adopting the NRC recommendations. And also the land clearing laws are at the 3-year point, and the New South Wales government committed to doing a review of the land clearing laws at this point. So the bill that is currently about to be debated actually ignores the finding of the Audit Office, the Natural Resources Commission, the Parliamentary Inquiry, and the independent review of biodiversity legislation that galvanised the land clearing laws in the first place. So what we have here is a bill that is actually going to weaken protections for koalas on the basis of zero evidence and against the findings and evidence that have been saying very, very clearly what needs to be done to prevent koala extinction. So in terms of the key changes in the bill, I'll just touch on 3. There's more in the briefing note. First of all, the bill is actually going to freeze in time the 5 areas that have actually mapped koala habitat. So 5 LGAs that have mapped koala habitat in a plan of management. At the moment, those areas of koala habitat are mapped and they're sensitive regulated land under land clearing laws. And that means there are tiny little areas that are carved out from code-based land clearing. What this bill is saying is any future habitat that is mapped under a koala plan of management won't actually interact with land clearing laws. And this means that the self-assessed codes, that the mechanism that's actually reintroduced broad-scale land clearing to New South Wales, will be able to be done in koala habitat. It is actually preventing koala habitat from being mapped and applicable under land clearing laws on private land in the future. Another thing the bill is doing is it's actually going to undermine E-zones, so environmental zones on rural land. This has been a long time agenda. This isn't related necessarily to the koala SEP, but we're seeing it in this bill. What it's doing is categorising a new area of allowable activity land that will allow land clearing exemptions in E-zones. Now, the purpose of E-zones is they've been categorised because of their environmental value. The E-zoning doesn't actually prevent clearing. It just says if you are going to clear in these areas, you need to do a little bit more assessment. What they're saying is we'll exempt those areas too. And the third thing that this bill is doing that is of concern is that it's making changes to private native forestry, including preventing local councils through their local environment plan from requiring a DA for private native forestry. And it's also extending private native forestry plans from 15 years to 30 years. So it's locking in the inadequate requirements now for up to 30 years. There's a PNF review on foot that has not been completed yet. So this bill is also preempting that review. In addition to this bill, underpinning this bill are amendments that have been made to the SEP. These were published on Friday. So these include, they've removed all references to a koala development application map. So the map was supposed to set out, or it was supposed to clarify the inadequate definitions of koala habitat. So due to the abandonment of this koala development application map, that means that now there's a clause in the SEP that will have to, instead of providing an upfront assessment to identify land that would be subject to assessment, this new clause requires councils to determine whether an application will have no or low impact on koala habitat or a high impact on a case-by-case basis. The definition of core koala habitat has been slightly tightened again. There's now a new requirement for councils to have to consult with the Chief Executive Officer of Local Land Services now when they want to make a koala plan of management. And there's also a change to things like the maps that are publicly available. Previously, the SEP said the maps under this policy will be on the New South Wales Planning Portal. Now it says the one remaining map that is left after the argy-bargy will be deposited at the head office of Department of Planning and made available for public access. So we're shrinking transparency and accountability, as well as shrinking protections for koalas. The guideline has also been changed. References to the koala development application map have been removed. Consultation provisions for landholders to object to a koala plan of management have been extended. There's now 90 days, and then landholders can also request a council for an extra 60 days to object, and also request that that council must pay for the assessment of that land. So there is potential for delays in koala plans of management being made by councils, and also resource burdens on local councils who are actually trying to do the right thing and make a plan. So there's a range of changes made to the guideline and the SEP as a result of the capitulation by the government recently. But in terms of this actual bill, what it's doing is weakening land clearing laws against all the evidence and the recommendations that have said you need to strengthen land clearing laws. So I'll just finish with a quote from the Audit Office. This is what they said last year. They found the clearing of native vegetation on rural land is not effectively regulated and managed because the processes in place to support the regulatory framework are weak. There is no evidence-based assurance that clearing of native vegetation is being carried out in accordance with approvals. Responses to incidents of unlawful clearing are slow with few tangible outcomes. Enforcement action is rarely taken against landholders who unlawfully clear native vegetation. There are processes in place for approving land clearing, there's limited follow-up to ensure approvals are complied with. So basically we have regulatory failure, we have open slather for clearing, and what this bill is doing is allowing further exemptions and further clearing in koala habitat. And that would be the exact opposite of what needs to happen to prevent koalas going extinct in New South Wales by 2050.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks so much. And just before we go to dial-in, I just want to say thanks to the MPs that have joined. So Greg Piper, Justin Field, Mark Pearson, Tamara Smith, and I think some staff representing other MPs. So thanks for jumping into this meeting.
Okay. Kate, could I just ask one question of Rachel? Just a quick one. When there's an application from a landholder to review a council decision about their land, during that delay, are they restrained from doing anything on their land in relation to koala habitat?
Well, there's already so many exemptions that they can clear anyway. I think they could continue doing the normal activities and continue to clear during that time anyway. But the new guideline does allow 90 days and then an additional 60 days to delay the making of the plan. But in the meantime, there's still significant clearing that is already facilitated under the land clearing laws.
Okay, so they're not restrained.
Okay, sorry, I'm so conscious.
That's all right. I just wanted to have it clarified.
G'day. Look, I just want to give a brief presentation. I've done a detailed assessment, but I won't go into that in any detail at the moment, but I'm happy to provide to people if they want to. I've put my phone number up and my email address if anyone wants it. So basically, you know, koalas were in trouble, and I'm just dealing with North East New South Wales. Koalas were in trouble. They had about 50% decline up until over 20 years, up until before the fires. They were predicted to be extinct by 2050. And then in 2019-20, we lost about 30% of the high quality koala habitat on the North Coast in the fires. And most of the koalas were killed in that process. So koalas are in dire straits. And we've had the Koala Inquiry confirm that, and yet now the government is trying to remove existing protections, the protections we've had for 25 years for koalas. So first off, I'd like to point out that koalas prefer bigger trees. They like the same trees that the loggers want. I think it's really important to recognise that there is this conflict between koalas using them as feed trees and loggers cutting them down and selling them. I also think it's important to recognise that land clearing has skyrocketed in New South Wales, and most of it we don't even know why it's occurring. So we've got this massive increase in land clearing. It's unregulated. It's an open slather out there, and a lot of that's going to be koala habitat. And then, so regarding private native forestry, there's 467,000 hectares approved for private native forestry already, and 95% of that's on the north coast of New South Wales. And in addition to that, we have 61% of high quality koala habitat on private property in northeast New South Wales. So koala's future depends upon protecting koalas on private property. There's no doubt about it. And the New South Wales government recently compared their high timber value areas on private native forestry properties with high quality koala habitat, and they found the same thing. Koalas like the same areas that loggers like, with 55%, for example, of areas with very high timber values also having high quality koala habitat. And then the other thing to be aware of is that 45% of North Coast private native forestry areas were burnt in the fires. It's a very high percentage, and yet we're doing nothing to mitigate those impacts. So the wildlife have been severely impacted, the streams have been severely impacted, but we're not doing anything, not changing the rules at all to mitigate it. And also it's important to recognise that when P&F approvals are given, that's the rules that apply at that time that go with that P&F plan. So if we've got grossly inadequate rules now, if we change the length of a P&F from 15 to 30 years, we're entrenching those grossly inadequate rules for an extra 15 years, not allowing any changes that occur to be taken into account into the future. The koala SEP, So the koala tip is a great idea. It's been a huge improvement, the thing that I think is most important, this has been a requirement since 1995, it's nothing new, is that they're required to identify core koala habitat, prepare a koala plan of management, identify core koala habitat, and if core koala habitat is identified, or when it's identified, forestry operations are not permitted within any area identified as core koala habitat. And it's designated as Category 2 sensitive regulated land, and therefore it requires approval before clearing. So you can use the farm type exemptions, but you can't use many of the other exemptions allowed under the legislation. So currently in North East New South Wales, we have 6,922 hectares protected as sensitive regulated land. So this is areas that have been identified in koala plans of management as core koala habitat, and because they're not protected by other measures, they've been moved into sensitive regulated land and therefore require approval. I will also point out that 200 properties in core koala habitat have been approved for logging. We'll go further forward in time, and we have the 2019-20 koala inquiry. And the thing to recognise is it looked at all forms of koala management, but the one thing that they were unanimous on, and this is a multi-party committee, was that there is virtually no protection for koalas on private land. So that was their conclusion. We need to improve it, we need to fix it. It just wasn't there at the moment, and that's certainly our experience. And so given that is the finding of the committee, of all the parties, we now have the National Party turn around and saying there's more than adequate protection on private land when they know that's not the case. So I just find that reprehensible, really. So what's all this about? All these amendments to the Local Land Services Act are about making koalas extinct. There's nothing in there to help protect koalas, to protect their habitat. It's about opening up the core koala habitat that we've so far identified, which is not much. There's a lot more out there that needs to be identified, and a lot of councils have identified it, but it's just the government hasn't approved their koala plans of management, so it gets no protection. It's to open it up for land clearing and for logging. And the main issue here is it's all about logging, stopping councils from prohibiting logging in any zones, stopping councils from even protecting environmental protection zones. It's just really frightening, really. Once they give these approvals for logging, they're going to do for 30 years. The local government can't do anything about it. If you're building a house, you've got to get approval, you've got to go through all these steps. But if you're clearing and logging hundreds of hectares, you don't need to do any approval except from this shoddy process the government requires, which provides no real protection. So really, this is all about gutting protections for the koalas and the koala steps being gutted and made virtually useless. I personally really can't see much point now in any council preparing a koala plan and management to identify core koala habitat. You've got all these hoops to jump through, and then there's all these outs once you do it. So, you know, in the end, it only applies now to developments under Part 4 of the EP&A Act, and a developer can then go prepare their own koala plan and management and override whatever the council comes up with anyway. So I just think it's totally made the koala step ineffective and virtually useless. I would like to be corrected, but I really can't see much point in doing it anymore. I think it's going to be more of a burden on councils. We've had a really poor uptake, one every 4 years, and on average in koala plans of management. Why would any council do it in the future? Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dylan. I'm sure there's questions for Dylan as well, but I want to go straight to Dominic King, who is the Mayor for Bellingen, who will be able to give the perspective of what it's like for a council with a koala plan of management, but not in this legislation and not recognised by the government. Dom.
Hi, everyone. I've also got the General Manager here with me, Liz Jeremy, and our Senior Strategic Planner, Daniel Bennett, who did our initial koala plan of management. We've actually found out today of those six councils that have got KPOMs signed off on, we're excluded from. We're actually back on the sort of line with every other council that hasn't got a KPOM. For some reason, Bellingen's been taken off that list of the 6 with a KPOM. So I have very big concerns about why that's happened just to us, and there's been no explanation about that. So in our KPOM already, about a third of that land that's core koala habitat has already got existing private native forestry agreements on that, and there's nothing that we can do about that. But it meant that there couldn't be any new ones. But now we've been taken off that for some reason, which is really, really disturbing as well. What we've seen in the Bellingen Shire since the fires has been an absolute massive upscale in the amount of logging that's come through Bellingen. And I've spoken to many locals that have been here a long, long time, and they have never seen as many logging trucks coming out of our shire and heading up the highway. They're actually burning forest waste now at so-called forest waste at Broadwater Power Station and calling that renewable energy. So they're taking every stick, every little twig is being wood chipped on site and now shipped up to Broadwater and burnt. And now we're starting to see an emergence of more private native forestry. We had one at the Upper Kalang that's just about finished, and they are taking massive trees out of there. Council has very little power to do anything because even our bridges are, the load limits on our bridges have been lifted so that we can get fire trucks and school buses over it. But what that's happened now is that's allowed actually the forest, the loggers to pull out, massive big trucks coming up, destroying our roads, putting heaps of pressure on our bridges. And those areas up there, we know that they contain not only koalas, but many other endangered species. And there is nothing that's been done about that in terms of site assessments or ecological assessments on those properties. We can't legally get any access to see what's going on. We have massive concerns about erosion. We have really, really fragile soils up here, big, heavy rainfall events. So we are, the community here is, I've been constantly contacted by community members saying, you guys have got to do something about this. And we are at a loss. After those fires, after what we've seen, what we lost in those fires and the anxiety everyone had about what was happening to our amazing environment and thinking there was going to be some action to get this has been an absolute slap in the face. And so, we are really, really concerned about, it was bad enough before. The PNF laws were bad enough before where you could get an approval in less than 24 hours to log a property. And what we're seeing here is logging companies going around and letterboxing people and telling them they can earn $20,000 or $30,000, and we're just going to come in and take a couple of trees. And the reality is much, much different than what they're saying. They come in and absolutely trash the place. There's no controls over the roads that are going in there and the slope, the degrees of slopes or whatever they're logging on. So this to me feels like the last nail in the coffin for the koalas in this region. And on top of that, we're being punished more than any other local government area, and that's because we've stood up really, really strongly for the Great Koala National Park. We see that as an absolute economic, environmental, social and cultural benefit for this whole region. And it absolutely makes sense that they do that. And we're just getting a pushback from the Nats. And now we're being punished for, standing up for the rights of koalas and all those amazing animals in our environment. So yeah, I am a little bit pissed off today, to tell you the truth. I can't believe that this is where we are after those fires. I thought we would get some action. I thought we would actually start to question what we had left and start protecting it. And all I've seen in this shire has been the complete opposite.
Thanks so much, Dom. Now I'm going to go straight, recognising we're in meeting format. The best way to do this is if people have any questions to raise your hand in the participants thing, if you like. So I just wanted to see, is there any points of clarification on the bill or anything that people want to ask, particularly the MPs and staff on the line around the bill? And I'll just kick off. Can I just get a sense from all of you? So just to be clear, the government has said they were improving protections in this koala planning policy after the recent fires and to do a bit more for koalas. Now that the National Party had their dummy spit, this compromise, is it, in your view, taking us back to the old planning policy, or is it just doing so much more and so much worse than that planning policy? Because that's certainly what it seems like, judging from your contributions. Rachel?
I think the changes are weakening protections for koalas and koala habitat. It's freezing in time what was painfully achieved in 20 years under the last step, and it's actually stymieing any progress beyond that in terms of identifying new koala habitat and putting the protections on that habitat that are needed to stop koala extinction.
Dylan, what's your view?
Yeah, look, I think it's been extremely disappointment how poorly the previous step was implemented. But nonetheless, over those 25 years, we made some progress. We had some core koala habitat identified. That identified habitat was then protected from logging. And it took a while to even get that in place. It wasn't until 2007 that came into place. And we had some of that land identified as sensitive rural lands, and at least had some constraints on land clearing on it. And now we're losing all that. And we're not only losing it for the 6,900 hectares that we've so far had protected. Well, sorry, I think 900 hectares in Belgium's going totally. The other 6,000 hectares, I'm assuming will be opened up for logging, but it may retain some land clearing controls, but probably not much. But it's the future that counts, and we really needed to expand the SEP process. We need to identify that core koala habitat across the landscape and give it some form of protection. At the moment now, what we've done is remove any need to identify core koala habitat. We have the government saying it will no longer be allowed to be protected by councils, by environmental zoning, and virtually anything goes in it. So this is a major backward step. But this takes us back more than 25 years when we need to be going forward.
So instead of strengthening protection on private land, which is what they said they'd do, they basically removed protections, and core koala habitat now can't be identified or protected on private land as a result of this, essentially.
I believe it's open further now on core koala habitat and private land, and it could actually be worse than that. Certainly Ben Franklin in his speech in Parliament said that councils won't be allowed to use a koala plan management to zone land for environmental protection. I didn't read that in the bill, but that certainly appears to be their intent. So it's actually counterproductive for councils now to identify core koala habitat because they won't be allowed to protect it. That seems to be the intent.
Just to clarify, just for Dylan, you may have been referring to Mr. Ben Franklin's speech on the shooters bill.
I was, but he
Okay.
was referring to what their changes they're making in their new bill. So he was very clearly saying he gave his undertaking to the shooters and fishers that a koala plan and management would not be allowed to do environmental zoning in the future.
Gotcha. Okay, Dom, do you have thoughts on that question? Just you're on mute, Dom. You're on mute.
Sorry, Kate, I'm trying to do two things at once, but I wanted to ask the question, actually, if there's someone there that knows why we've been excluded, because for us, it's much, much worse, because the area that we thought we now could rely on, and we'd had an agreement done, we'd spoken to those landholders, we'd done all that stuff to say, you know, this is the way forward. We're not going to have any new P&Fs on there, and we were going to work on the people with those existing P&Fs to say, hey, can we do some conservation agreement or whatever about protecting that core koala habitat? That's now been wiped out. And I don't understand how we've been singled out for that. I know the reason why. I can imagine what the reason is for that, but we haven't been given an explanation. Our planners are going, we've got no idea why. We've been the one that's been singled out. So
it's also, Dom, just for those on the meeting as well, there are other councils that have had their koala plans of management submitted to the department for years now, trying to get approval. So councils like Tweed, I think Byron as well, and some others have now done years of work, years of mapping work, and now won't be able to regulate, if you like, or have any control over private native forestry in their koala plans of management. And it expressly prohibits them to be able to put development consent in. So I don't know if anybody on the call can answer your question, Dom, because the Minister isn't here and the National Party isn't here, and they're the ones, I think, who have made the decision. All right. Are there any, is there any?
Kate, just, I mean, I think, you know, what with the review, I mean, the other question is about the P&F review, because that's really the biggest issue for us is the P&F, you know, more so than the set.
Yes.
But that review that was going through, I mean, what we were asking for was consent for local government, you know, as a dual consent to allow us to know actually when private native forestry was occurring and where and when, even in regard to our bridges and, you know, the dust impacts on our residents, you know, let alone the impacts on our biodiversity. But for them to jump ahead of that is another thing that really concerns us, because private native forestry, even without it being in core koala habitat, because we know that lots of our shire is, if not core, very close to, and areas that we've been told have no koalas in them. There's been koalas with young spotted in them, plus a whole range of other endangered species. So even the mapping of that, you know, I would imagine there is a much bigger section of our shire that should be included in core koala habitat. So that's going to be open for you know, people to come in. And like I say, I mean, there is people doing it really tough in this shire, and it's only going to get worse. So there's going to be more opportunity for those loggers to come in and say to people, do you want to earn $20,000 or $30,000, and we're going to come in and take some logs? And we are going to lose so much more than what state forests have done, because state forests have really run out of wood in this shire. They haven't got much left that's accessible. So we're really concerned about the impacts on private land here for a whole numerous list of reasons. And it is really concerning for us, and I'm sure the residents here would be very concerned about this new stuff.
Yes, thanks, Tom. That's one of the reasons in terms of doing this brief for both MPs and the media is this bill has been rushed through without any consultation. And not only that, is a massive overreach in terms of what I just can't imagine how the Premier and the Planning Minister have let this go through. If I don't think they understand it. I just don't. Yeah, I can't see a Premier who has said she wants to save koalas approving a plan like this, when we know, as Dylan said, we have to protect core koala habitat on private land as well, or else koalas will become extinct before 2050. So that's it, I think. I've said very strictly that this would be half an hour. I know everybody's really busy. We will send, Dylan, we've had requests for your slides again. So we will send through, we've taken a note of people's emails. We will send people, if you want a copy of Dylan's slides, throw your email quickly into the chat and we'll grab that and send that to you. The 3 stakeholders on the call are all available for interview in terms of media who are on the call. Thanks for joining us, as well as anybody, any MPs or staff, obviously they're happy to advise. Fingers crossed we can hold this off. We're also trying to get the bill referred to a committee in the upper house to at least have some scrutiny on it, so that everybody's well aware of the huge ramifications of this bill on not just koala habitat, but on a lot of sensitive environmental land on private land. So thanks for joining, everybody, and yeah, get in touch if you need to.
Thanks, Kate, and everyone.
Thank you.